Heinz is one of the ultimate examples of a classic American brand. It goes back to the 1800s, and still, almost a century and a half later, it remains one of the most recognized names in food. I mean, we've all had the ketchup, right? I think that's a safe assumption, considering they are always, by far, the #1 brand, with well over a 50% share of that market. They claim to sell over 650 million bottles of it across 140 countries each year, amounting to sales of more than $1.5 billion. Impressive numbers, but probably not shocking, considering that we know Heinz dominates the ketchup market. But what you might be shocked to hear is that this company goes well beyond ketchup. They always have. They didn't start by making ketchup, and throughout most of their history, the majority of their business has relied on other products. So for this video, I want to talk about the evolution of Heinz by focusing on 5 of their sales categories that I believe to be among the most historically significant. Starting off with the obvious one, condiments. The name Heinz comes from Henry Heinz, who started the company in a way that you might not expect. See, his parents had immigrated from Germany to the United States, where they started a brickyard, but on that property, there was also an area for gardening, which turned out to be a passion for a young Henry Heinz. By the time he was 10 years old, he was growing his own produce and selling it to his neighbors. Specifically, he would grate his own horseradish that was like at the center of it. So by the time he was a teenager, he already had his own successful business, where he would employ people to deliver his homemade products to various grocery stores around Pittsburgh. He made enough money to pay for himself to go to business school, where he studied bookkeeping and accounting, and even returned to apply that knowledge to help out his parents' business. By 1869, when he was 25 years old, he partnered with a friend of his named L.C. Noble, who was able to provide financing, and started this company that was specifically intended to sell horseradish, though they quickly expanded into other condiments as well, such as sauerkraut and pickles. However, this original business did not do well. I think it had a solid start, but by 1875, everything had taken a turn. They were feeling the effects of the financial panic of 1873, and I believe that they contracted with a farm to buy all of the cucumbers that they grew that year, but since business was down and they ended up growing way more cucumbers than were expected, Heinz and Noble couldn't honor that contract. Forced them into bankruptcy, the company crumbled, and the whole thing just ended in disaster. But I do want to point out that for someone so strongly known for his ketchup, for the first 30 years of his life, all of his professional endeavors were centered around horseradish. Fortunately, within the year, he was able to start up a new business with a couple of family members, and this one turned out to be infinitely more successful. But interestingly, again, this business was not centered around ketchup. Their original hit product was pickles. That's how they first gained attention, so much so that Henry Heinz quickly became known as the Pickle King. And I do want to talk about a few of the things that made this attempt so successful. Part of it was utilizing clear glass jars for his products, because it was still at a time where food safety was mostly unregulated, so being able to see the food that was in the container was reassuring to the customers. Also not nearly as common at the time was variety and food branding, two things that made Heinz stand out from most others. In 1896, he came up with the idea of advertising that he sold 57 varieties. Even today, you've probably seen the 57 on Heinz products. But the thing is that the 57 never really meant anything. He had seen a sign advertising that a company sold 21 styles of shoes and thought that using a specific odd number like that was a good way to catch people's attention. At the time, he sold around 60 different products, so he chose a number close to that he felt was the catchiest. And then another likely contributor to his success is the fact that Henry Heinz had a reputation for being an ethical person that was pleasant to work for. I won't go too far into the details here, but he held high standards, created good working conditions, was an advocate for food safety, and he even started the second business partially as a way to earn money to pay off the creditors from that first failed business. By the time he died in 1919, his company had 25 factories that employed 6,500 people. Going back to my list, Heinz was all about condiments during the days of Henry Heinz. First it was horseradish, and then pickles, and then of course ketchup eventually became the thing that we all associate with them, but one of their first successes outside of condiments was baby food. When Henry Heinz passed away, way, his son Howard Heinz took over, and what many consider to be his greatest contribution to the company was in 1931 during the Great Depression when he introduced a line of baby food. That was a time when nutrition was a big concern, especially for babies, given the financial situation for many families, so this new product on the market, made by an already trusted name like Heinz, was well received. They introduced it in Britain a few years later, and in the following decades became one of the world's biggest sellers of it. In 1994, they bought the British baby food brand Farley's for $140 million and the Indian baby food company Glaxo for $70 million, after which they controlled about a third of the global market. I thought this was interesting. In 2000, they were trying to buy the company that made beech nut baby food. It was the third largest seller in the US, while Heinz was already the second largest, each controlling around 14% of the market. Meanwhile, Gerber was the clear leader at 70%. However, the Justice Department didn't allow the deal to happen because they feared that things wouldn't be competitive enough if 98% of the market was controlled by two companies. So oddly enough, even though the combination would have been much smaller than Gerber, still, they didn't allow it to happen. Another early market for Heinz that I think is interesting was tuna. In 1961, they acquired the company Starkist Foods, who was already well known for their mascot, Charlie the Tuna. By 1988, when Starkist had become the biggest tuna brand in the United States, they wanted to add to it by spending $200 million to buy Bumblebee, which at the time was the third largest tuna brand. But again, it was not allowed to happen for fears of a monopoly because the combined company would have controlled more than half of the US tuna market. But in 1997, they were allowed to buy the United Kingdom's biggest brand of tuna called John West, briefly making Heinz the biggest tuna company in both regions. However, in 2002, in an effort to refocus on their more successful core products, they made this complex $1.8 billion transaction where they spun off a bunch of brands into their own separate company, and then that company merged with Del Monte Foods. One of the brands involved was Starkist, and then in 2006, they got out of the market completely when they sold John West Foods as well. The next category that I want to talk about is somewhat related, and that is pet food. Believe it or not, Heinz used to be one of the country's biggest pet food companies. I say that it's somewhat related to the tuna because it started back when they acquired Starkist. It turns out that making cans of tuna and making cans of cat food aren't entirely different from each other. That's why Starkist started a brand of cat food called 9 Lives, a brand that I'm sure many people recognize because once Heinz obtained it in that acquisition, they did quite a bit to help it grow into one of the biggest brands on the market. In fact, it was under their ownership in the 1960s when the 9 Lives mascot, Morris, was first introduced. Then, in 1995, Heinz spent $725 million to acquire the North American pet food business of Quaker Oats. It included many popular brands such as Kibbles and Bits and Pupperoni, both names that are just fun to say. It was a deal that made Heinz the third largest seller of pet food in the United States, with sales in that segment of more than $1 billion a year. But again, that didn't last long because their pet food segment was also separated in that complex deal with Del Monte in 2002, following a very similar path to their involvement with tuna. The final category on my list is frozen foods, and this is a big one. In 1965, they acquired the company Ore-Ida. You would likely know them for their frozen french fries and tater tots and other potato products. And that name, by the way, Ore-Ida, comes from a combination of the words Oregon and Idaho. They were located near the border and would grow their potatoes in those two states. And of course, you know their slogan, when it says Ore-Ida, it's all right. Oh man, if you bought that brand anytime since the 1960s, you have bought them from Heinz. Another interesting one, maybe among the more unexpected, would be Weight Watchers. In the 1970s, Heinz was originally interested in buying this frozen food company that Weight Watchers was working with so they can combine it with Ore-Ida, but they ended up buying all of Weight Watchers for $71 million, going on to grow the company and sell all of that Weight Watchers branded frozen food, even starting the brand Smart Ones in 1992 as sort of a complement to the existing line. In 1999, they sold Weight Watchers for more than 10 times what they paid for it, but they did retain the licensing rights to sell the branded products. In fact, it was around that time when they entered into multiple deals to sell licensed frozen food products, probably the most notable ones being Boston Market in 1999, just months after their bankruptcy, and TGI Fridays in 2001. So when you see those at the grocery store, they are made by Heinz. The restaurants are just given a percentage of the sales for the rights to use the brand. And I should also mention Bagel Little Bites. They were acquired in 1991 as part of this $500 million deal and have since been utilizing that Ore-Ida branding. So there you have it. That is my list of what I feel have been the most notable or unexpected product categories for Heinz. But I do want to make it clear that it is not a complete list. Heinz has sold so many things over the years that don't fit into any of these categories. Soups have been big, first introducing tomato soup in the 1800s and continuing their involvement in many different ways ever since. Sauces have been another major part of it. In 2001, they made a deal that gave them control of the pasta sauce brand Classico, and then in 2005, they made a different deal that put them in charge of the brand Lee and Perrins. And obviously, the baked beans, there's a lot that could be said about that. And keep in mind that my list is meant to be the categories that I found to be the most significant or interesting to talk about. Though I suppose I should finish up the story, because in 2013, big things started happening at Heinz. That year, for the first time ever, Heinz themselves was acquired. They were bought by Warren Buffett's company, Berkshire Hathaway, and a Brazilian investment firm called 3G Capital in a deal valued at $23 billion. Remember, before any of this happened, Heinz had grown into a company with well over $10 billion in sales each year. Then, only 2 years later, the next big thing happened when Heinz merged with Kraft, another massive, impactful deal, considering Kraft was also the owner of a bunch of popular food brands. If you want more specifics, I have a previous video about it, but the combination of the two created the third largest food and beverage company in the US and the fifth largest in the world. But since that merger, Kraft Heinz, as it's now called, has been underperforming. They've been criticized for lacking innovation, being too focused on cost cutting, not offering healthy enough foods, letting their brands lose value. It becomes a whole separate, complex subject, but that is how Heinz exists today. Let me know in the comments, did you know all of this about Heinz? I think it's easy enough to mistake them for a basic ketchup company, or maybe one that has ventured into a few other products, but this is a pretty extensive history. It has been over a century, with a lot happening with them in a lot of different areas, so any thoughts you have about Heinz, their ketchup, or any of these other foods, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.